Ipsos polling exclusively for Global News shows the Liberals had a 5-point lead at 36% of the popular vote over the Conservatives' 31% before Bill Morneau resigned. After Morneau left, Liberal support dipped to 34% and Conservative support rose to 33%, making for a statistical tie. NDP support dropped from 19 to 16%, the Bloc gained 4 points, rising to 9%, and the Greens' 7% remains unchanged, as does the 2% of Canadians who would vote for other parties. Despite the decrease in support for the Liberals, 52% of Canadians say they approve of the Liberal government's performance under Justin Trudeau. When it comes to managing the economy through the recession and impact of COVID-19, the Liberals come out on top, with 35% of Canadians choosing them, followed by the Conservatives at 30%, NDP at 14%, the Bloc at 5%, the Greens at 4%, and other parties at 12%.
Well, I think the most interesting thing from the poll is that we were able to measure the immediate impact of Bill Morneau's resignation as finance minister of Canada. We were actually in field as his resignation was tendered, and so we're able to compare what Canadians were saying about who they would vote for ahead of the resignation, and then again look at the results after the resignation. And it was a 5-point Liberal lead, rather, a 5-point Liberal lead before the resignation, and it shrank to just 1-point Liberal lead following the resignation. So, it may be a knee-jerk reaction. It's still too early to say whether or not, it's the start of a decline or a trend for the Liberal Party, but at least in the short term, it has had an impact. I think, Canadians already knew something was up, so guilt or innocence isn't really, I think, part of the equation, but it does signal a bit of a pattern for the Prime Minister. I think the sort of half-baked rationale as to why Bill Morneau is leaving, most Canadians would kind of see through it and say, well, they weren't getting along. There's also the Wee scandal, so I think Canadians kind of already knew what was up, but the fact that it did cost the Minister of Finance his job, doesn't just reflect on the Minister of Finance. It reflects on the Prime Minister as well. It's a two-way street, and Canadians were weighing in and saying, I may, some of them, very, a relatively small proportion, but enough that it makes the horse race a lot closer than it was even just a couple of days ago. So we actually haven't looked at horse race numbers for months now. We've had bigger issues to tackle, namely COVID-19. What we had looked at was the approval ratings of the Prime Minister. And at one point, they were in the 70s. They still weren't as high as the provincial premiers, but approval ratings in the high 70s would be, the envy of most leaders around the world. The Prime Minister's come back to earth. He's now in the mid-50s, which, granted, is still very high for a second-term Prime Minister. So there's no doubt that the majority of Canadians in almost every province, save Alberta and Saskatchewan, approve of the performance of the Prime Minister. And yet, we're in a situation where the Conservatives are within striking distance and don't even have a leader. So at some point, those two metrics, an approval rating in the 50s, but a vote in the low to mid 30s, need to reconcile. And I think part of that reconciliation is to come when the Conservatives figure out who their next leader is, right? Maybe a lot of people sitting on the fences right now saying, well, I'm not sure which way I'm going to go. It may depend on who the Conservatives have as leader. And also, I think part of the balance here, the tipping point, is seeing what the Prime Minister's plans are going forward. I think a lot of people approve and acknowledge that, the $300+ billion deficit was the right thing to do up until this point, to make sure that Canadians don't fall off an economic cliff. But I don't think Canadians are quite as convinced in the merits of deep deficit spending going forward. And this takes us back to Bill Morneau, right? It's it sounds like he didn't approve of that either going forward, and maybe didn't want to spend quite as much as we did up to this point. So I think there are a lot of unknown questions, unknown things in people's minds. Maybe the prorogation, even though, it upsets a lot of people, maybe it's a good thing. Maybe we will have a chance to hear about the Prime Minister's plans going forward. If the opposition parties don't like it, they can force a confidence vote. There will be a confidence vote on the throne speech, on the budget, and maybe even force an election. I still think there's, maybe an outside chance of an election, but hey, the Conservatives must be emboldened by the results of this poll, which show that they're in striking distance. We know that the Bloc under Blanchette he's already said that, if the Prime Minister doesn't resign, he's going to force a vote, non-confidence against the Prime Minister in the fall. We're going to get that anyway now with the throne speech and a budget. So I think there's going to be a lot of political brinkmanship in the months ahead. We may take the next couple of weeks off, but once that throne speech happens in September, I think the parties are going to come out with all guns a-blazing, and we'll see who blinks first. It's difficult to say because it's not Conservative voters who are electing the leader. It's Conservative members, and they're a different breed from the general population. So whereas I think Liberals will often try to elect somebody who's sort of most electable, Conservatives don't always have that first and foremost in their mind. They're looking at someone who best reflects their values or their policy priorities. And so I think all along we put a poll out back in March that showed that Peter MacKay, just on name recognition alone, had an advantage, but who knows? And we'll be releasing a poll in the next day or so that looks at that in a little bit more detail. But I think Canadians are waiting to see what happens, and I think there will be a good chunk of people who may not want to support the Liberal government because of some of the lapses in ethics, let's say. And the alternative is normally the Conservative Party, which has a big question mark until this weekend. And if it's a leader that whose name isn't Peter MacKay, I think it's an even bigger question mark because the other three nominees aren't very well known to most Canadians. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It provides a bit of a blank slate for people to get to know the new leader. But I think, until there's somebody who's widely known by Canadians, the Liberals will have the advantage. And on one key issue, which is management of the economy and COVID-19, the Liberals still have an advantage over the Conservatives. And in order for Conservatives to win an election, they absolutely must be chosen as the party that's best to lead the economy. And they're not yet. So they've got a lot of work to do still to I think, really pose a significant challenge to the Liberals in the next election, whenever it is. But they're within striking distance. There's absolutely the possibility that it could happen.